My name is Benton Stokes. I'm a former fundamentalist, post-evangelical worship leader, and songwriter. I enjoy wry Manhattans, roller coasters, and road trips, just not all at the same time.
I'm Elane O'Rourke, and I'm a teacher, an author, and a spiritual coach. I was a philosophy professor and a liberal pastor in a couple of former lives, and these days, I love aha moments and not-so-dry martinis.
We have conversations about life and God with a queer perspective, over cocktails, like you. This is Cocktail Theology.
Have you ever had a couple of days that felt like they were like 2 weeks long?
Oh, yeah.
So that's where I am, and so I'm so glad to see this frosty glass of whatever it is. What is it?
So the cocktail we're having today is called the Frisco. It was in a bar book that was put out by the Stork Club way back in the 1940s.
Yes!
You know this one? All right, so it was
I know the Stork Club.
It's a famous bar from New York City in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. And it's called the Frisco. Don't know why. I went looking, but I couldn't find a reason. And it is whiskey, in our case, rye. Okay. It's Benedictine, and it's lemon juice. And then it's got a pretty healthy dash each of Angostura and orange bitters.
Okay. All right. Ooh.
It's nice, right?
That's really good.
Yeah, it's surprisingly smooth to have...
So much lemon juice.
Yeah, well, and rye you don't think of as necessarily smooth, and Benedictine has a bite.
Yeah.
But you put the three together, and somehow it's like really, really smooth.
Yeah, well, and the particular bitters are really helping it too.
Mm-hmm. So the Frisco.
Yay!
Is where we're starting today.
So what are we talking about today, sir?
Well, I was waxing rhapsodic the other day.
As you are wont to do.
As I often rhapsodize. And I was thinking about back when I was writing Christian music. And even before that, back when I was just a fervent consumer of Christian music.
Yes.
And that goes all the way back to when I was in high school. I loved it. I loved listening to it. I basically decided I wasn't going to listen to pop music or rock music anymore. I was only going to listen to Christian music. And mostly during my high school years, that's what I did. And I do believe that it was really formative for me in like my songwriting and definitely my love for worship music.
When you say Christian music, you mean contemporary pop that is toned toward evangelical Christian views?
Yes.
Okay. So, because I think Christian music, I think Taizé.
Oh, right.
Right? I mean, hymns, I think of all kinds of wonderful Christian music, but that's not that. So It's really, I like that you used Christian pop. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And then we used to make fun of Christian rock because it was like, let's take rock and just like redo the song over and over and over again. Anyway, but that's helpful. And then you start talking about worship music, and for me, worship is an interior thing or a gathering. So maybe you could take a second and tell us what worship music is for those of us who don't come from that tradition.
Sure. At the time, worship music, the way that I'm talking about it, was music that was being written in churches for use in worship services. So it wasn't a commercial effort so much as it was. These were just musicians who were writing these songs to be sung in the church. And this was when, praise and worship music is kind of the way we used to talk about it, was very chorus-centric. Some of them were just choruses with no verses. Okay. And it was sort of a modern way of approaching hymnody or giving a different spin on what congregations could sing and how they could sing it. Okay. That wasn't ancient hymns.
Got it. So, thank you for that.
So that was kind of where it was at that time anyway. Okay. So the Christian pop of this time was sort of born out of the Jesus music movement, which happened in the late 60s, early 70s with artists like Larry Norman. Bob Dylan even had a part of it. There were artists that had been doing rock and roll and soul and other genres that were veering into what would become known as Christian music simply because they were sharing their faith with in a musical style that they already knew.
Yes, I remember that part.
And that their fans already liked, right? So they were selling these records that were really, Christian music. It was just packaged the way that their fans would enjoy it. And it was a little subversive, I guess, for the time because, certainly Christians weren't endorsing rock and roll. Rock and roll was the devil's music. So to have rock and roll with Christian lyrics was a very new and scary idea to many Christians back in the 70s and even into the 80s.
For sure.
But Christian pop was becoming respectable, and these worship songs, modern worship, was starting to become pervasive within evangelical churches and even Catholic churches and some mainline churches as time went on through the 80s into the 90s. Right. I became really professionally involved in Christian music in the 90s. I auditioned for and joined a band, and before that I had bands of my own, and I was writing my own songs, both worship songs and also what I might refer to as inspirational songs, or songs that were sharing my story but through a faith lens.
Okay.
During that time, Christian music was shifting to being very radio-driven. The idea wasn't just to get on an artist's album, but to get on the radio. And Christian radio was growing at a pretty fast clip. And so most major markets by the mid-90s had at least one contemporary Christian radio station.
Okay.
And they were playing a variety of artists. Mm-hmm. And so the spectrum of artists that were recording Christian music, Christian pop music during that time and were being played on the radio was everything from Sandy Patty, who was like an operatic soprano with these big orchestral arrangements, to Amy Grant, who was doing kind of pop, synth pop, guitar-driven, pop, like singer-songwriter pop with a very sort of unassuming, approachable voice. You had rock bands, you had vocal groups, you had some that leaned into R&B and like classic Motown stylings. You had some that leaned into alternative and rock stylings that were heavily influenced by bands like U2.
Right.
The range of music on a Christian radio station was pretty wide at the time.
I'm reminded that we're talking essentially about white Christian music.
We are talking about white Christian music.
Because black gospel and all of that had a whole different trajectory.
It was a whole different place.
But I'm just trying to make sense of this because, again, what's Christian music?
Right.
But it made me think about the early 2000s when I was totally enraptured by Todd Agnew.
Yeah.
And like, I can't imagine hearing Todd Agnew on the radio anymore.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing has undergone quite a change. In the 90s, I was part of a cadre of songwriters that was writing for other artists to record. And our chances of getting on the radio were pretty good. And I got on the radio a lot. At the time, the predominance of worship music on the radio had not even begun. In fact, I worked for a very well-known record executive in the mid to late 90s who swore that worship music didn't belong on radio. Mm-hmm. Worship music was for church, and the radio was for something else.
Interesting.
And then about 5 years later, everything was completely different. Sure. Because the early aughts brought us Hillsong and Chris Tomlin and a host of mega churches that were turning out music and putting out records of their music, which then created this interesting sort of amalgam of what's on the radio, what's being sung in church. It's all kind of the same. And those songs that we were writing and sharing in the 90s, which were about our personal faith experience, went away. Because everything became Jesus-focused. Most of what you hear on K-Love or other Christian stations is all the same songs that the megachurches are singing on Sunday morning, and they all sound the same. Like, the tempo is the same, the vernacular is the same.
Right.
They're all white male-fronted by and large. And so the variety that existed in the 90s of just like different kinds of voices, different kinds of arrangements, all that's gone.
Right.
And so what we have now is a worship-driven model, and it is dominated by K-Love.
Right. Mega churches creating records, I'm using that in big scare quotes.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really smart marketing scheme for a large church to have a band that's creating music meant for the radio that then other people will hear and tie to that church. And so if you're on an expansion thing, then you've got essentially your own cover band
Yeah.
that is putting it out there, which
Yeah.
is such a different thing than there being an array of people expressing their individual or corporate views of things rather than, I mean, it sounds really like hyper commercial to me.
It is hyper commercial.
Okay.
Yeah, it has become hyper commercial. Whenever Hillsong, and Hillsong is a topic for another day, but whenever Hillsong starts writing for an album, they are writing for the church because they're thinking about two things at once. They're thinking about what will churches sing, which that's where they grew from. I mean, that's where they started. So that part is probably easier to do than the what will soccer moms listen to in their van. You need songs that do both.
Right.
And that's what has happened, is that
Okay.
now you have Hillsong and Gateway Church and Bethel Music and many others who are creating music for the radio that's also sung in church. So the rules for those songs are pretty rigid.
Okay.
Because first of all, you've got to tie in theologically with most every evangelical church, white evangelical church in the country.
Right.
So you've got that. And then the tempo has to sit in a pretty comfy place where it's not
Right.
dirgy for the car,
Right.
but it's also not too upbeat or celebratory for most churches, white evangelical churches, again, we're talking about.
Yeah.
So the tempo has to sit in this place, and the arrangements have to be homogeneous enough,
Right.
so that they translate from church to church to church to church.
Sure.
And they're very inoffensive and
Right.
very vanilla.
And so the idea is that if I am a member of that church, or if I wander through those churches, I can take a song I heard and that church, hear it on the radio, sing along with it while I'm doing whatever else I'm doing, and then go back to the church and hear it again. So it becomes a soundtrack for my
It
life.
becomes a soundtrack for your life.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And then where it gets interesting for me is that you have song publishers and record companies that are doing Christian pop for the purpose of radio hits to make money for their artists and for them and for their writers,
Right.
who are now working with churches to commercially promote, for the purpose of making money,
Right.
their songs that they're writing for their churches. So it's this
yeah.
it's this consumerist approach to writing music intended to worship God.
Okay. So it really sounds more like the purpose of the radio station is to promote these particular pieces of music, and the purpose of those particular pieces of music is to prop up the radio station and expand its reach. That's really interesting. Okay.
It's very interesting. And then to further complicate this, you have K-Love. And K-Love is a
Dominant.
dominant is an understatement. 500 plus stations and transmitters in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and they operate as a nonprofit, which means they get access to frequencies that are usually held for colleges,
Yeah.
other nonprofits, NPR, and they also do fundraisers to raise money for their organization, but they are in the billions of dollars.
Right. So they're public benefit in big scare quotes, which gives them all kinds of opportunity.
Right. They are the second largest owner of radio stations in the country.
And then they also have Air One too,
They
right?
also have Air One, which is another brand of what they do.
Right. Okay. Got it.
So, in and of itself, there are issues with all of that. But the thing that is interesting from a creative's point of view is that K-Love now is dictating what they will and won't play. So they are calling the shots in terms of what the tempo needs to be, what the subject matter needs to be, what the topics are they won't cover, who the artists are they won't play,
Sure.
including Dolly Parton, interestingly enough. So
Well, you know.
they are the ones that are actually driving what the record companies are doing. And then the record companies are going to the churches and saying, this is what we need from you to play on, to get onto K-Love, right? So the record companies are almost like this bridge between Hillsong and K-Love.
That's really interesting.
It's really weird.
It's kind of like if a news organization went to a group of people and said, if you want to be on the news, here's what you need to do.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because there's something about broadcast radio that is at least in theory, either about, I'm talking about music radio.
Yeah.
It's either about a collection of things that the DJ finds interesting,
Yeah.
or it's about what's coming up in the general public and what might we want to promote because it's interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
As opposed to it being this clear stream between large church or music people writing for that through a record company, which is really just kind of a conduit, because, you know, into the radio station. So it's really just one long stream.
Yeah.
So it becomes almost, wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so it becomes almost a private speaker for the record company
Yeah.
and the church.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
With the speaker telling them what
right.
it will play.
Right, of course.
And what it won't play. Right. So how all this figures in, I guess, to my rhapsodic waxing. I miss the days of diversity on the radio.
Yeah, for sure.
In Christian pop. Even in the white evangelical church, there was a breadth of musical style. There was a breadth of lyrical approach.
For sure.
A variety of tempos.
Okay, you shouldn't have to say that.
Isn't it ridiculous? It's so ridiculous. And then the toll that this took on the creative community in Nashville, because, you know, these writers that I was part of that community, are helping to feed this wonderfully creative community of Christian music that is providing this. I mean, it was a form of its own, but it was also sort of like this kind of safe alternative to scary culture, right? and so it's like we were writing these songs and having a great time, and I mean, I go back, and some of those songs that I listen to are a little cringy just because I was in a different place theologically. That was a different time for me, but at the same time, there are some songs back there that I'm really, really proud of.
Right.
And it's a shame because they don't get played on the radio anymore.
Right.
And all of those writers, save one or two that I can think of, have gone to writing all choral music, or they've moved to tiny micro niches like Southern gospel or positive country, or like they've moved into areas where songs are still important and needed. Right. And the value of testimony and inspirational music is still valued. Okay. Where at K-Love it doesn't appear to be so valued anymore.
Right. And K-Love is the one like dictatorial channel for the music. So if you're listening to K-Love, you're not getting anything except, wow, this is so mega church. I'm sorry.
It is completely mega church. It's all mega church, right?
Wow. Okay.
So then, of course, you're absolutely not getting queer voices. You're not getting divergent voices.
You're not getting 3/4 time voices. I mean, you're getting
no.
Yeah, it is one long narrative, literally, and one long sound of music to just kind of keep roping you into that whole wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I really miss enjoying Christian radio. I haven't listened to Christian radio in years and years because it's just become really bland, and because I lead worship, a lot of, my work is listening to these songs and figuring out, is there anything in here that is progressive theology, and 9 out of 10 songs are absolutely not, and that 10th one is questionable.
Right.
So it's promoting a very limited thread of
Right.
theological thought,
Right.
but it's bland enough to appeal to enough evangelicals that it hits most of the bases, right?
Of course.
But it's incredibly frustrating, and it's been sad to watch my friends that have stayed in Christian music or stayed writing songs that mean a lot to them and have nowhere to really go with them. It's a little bit sad. Now, for me, my migration was to more progressive thought, and I knew that I wasn't going to be writing for that industry anymore. So I began writing really for myself.
Right.
The songs that I write now are songs that I record.
Right.
So I can have whatever tempo I want. I can have whatever style I want, whatever production approach I want, because I'm not trying to get on K-Love.
Sure.
I would love, however, for there to be more outlets
Yes.
for queer Christian voices
Right.
to express themselves.
Yes.
Whether it's in music or art or poetry or spoken word or whatever.
Right.
Because the evangelical community has their thumb down on anything that is Christian art.
Right.
Unless you're talking about ancient art, which belongs to the Catholics and the Episcopals and the,
Orthodox, yeah.
Yeah, and so...
Yeah.
So it's just a sad time to try to be different and communicate. Well, not even be different. It's a sad time to try to convey your faith in an artistic way that doesn't sit well with the quote-unquote mainstream that's been established really by K-Love.
Right.
So we're left trying to find tiny micro niche audiences.
Sure.
I will say one thing, though. iTunes does not actually filter what makes their Christian playlist based on what K-Love plays. And so you do get queer artists like Flamey Grant and like Semler that will top, the iTunes
Right.
Christian song
I love when that happens
chart.
with Flamey and
Me too.
and Derek.
And that's just not possible
Right.
at K-Love.
Right.
We're left trying to find places to get our music heard.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is, first of all, the monopoly of K-Love
Yeah.
and its offshoots.
Right.
I'm also hearing the homogenization of both theology and musicality,
Yes. Right.
which, when you put those two together, seems very, I don't want to say culty exactly, but it becomes this kind of banalization
Yes.
of
That's a good way
theology
to talk
and
about it.
music, right? So it all becomes, it's like you put tiny amounts of Valium in the water, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's going along, and they're all just do
Yeah,
do
yeah.
do do, and then everything else feels jarring or
Yeah.
weird or challenges.
Right.
And since K-Love has so perfectly, I mean, frankly, kudos to their marketing and their way of doing it. I mean, it's evil. But other than that, they've become the voice of Christian evangelical music.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So one more thing. Rolling Stone did a really interesting article that came out back in January.
Wait. Rolling Stone?
Yes, Rolling Stone.
Rolling Stone. Okay.
Yes. That if our listeners are at all interested in this topic, you should seek it out. It was I believe it was in the January issue 2024 of Rolling Stone. Do go check it out. It's very eye-opening about K-Love's business model, the way they work. But, for me, all that is, there are a lot of issues with all of that.
Sure.
But for me, I think the part that hits me the hardest is just that Christian music, the way that I knew it and loved it, doesn't exist anymore at the level where it used to.
Sure.
Now, you can still find good Christian singer-songwriters
Sure.
who are doing this. Derek Webb is a great example. I mentioned Flamey and Similar, and I'll throw myself in there too. But there are good artists that are putting out music that falls into that sort of faith adjacent or through a faith lens kind of place. That I think actually speaks to a greater chunk of our culture at large than Christian evangelical pop ever will.
For sure. So
it's just a shame that it's harder to find. Listeners, we'd love to hear from you. If you like K-Love and if you like Christian radio today, we would love to hear from you and love to hear what it is about it that you enjoy. If you don't, or if you're like me and you long for the 90s, please do get in touch. CocktailTheology.com is where we are. We love hearing questions you have, ideas you have for episodes, and ideas you have for cocktails. So do reach out anytime.
Well, actually, if you know of writers who are doing kind of interesting music that have a Christian theological bent to them,
yes,
but still good music.
Yeah, that's important too.
Yeah, because we like good music.
Pass that along.
Please pass that along because we're hungry.
We're hungry for that. Thanks for listening.
I'm a little thirsty for more of this.
Yeah, let's do it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Change how life just seems to rearrange itself. No matter what it was, I don't know how it goes, but look, moving on feels pretty good. Moving on feels pretty good.
If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like and hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now. We welcome your comments, questions, and ideas for conversations and for cocktails. Please get in touch with us at our website, CocktailTheology.com. Cocktail Theology is a production of SFS. Our theme song is Moving On Feels Pretty Good, recorded by yours truly, Benton Stokes. You can find my music wherever you stream your favorite artists. Join us next Thursday for another new episode.